So, Adam, there were obviously two different themes or major stories coming off this game this past weekend, as immediately, and I mean like seconds after the game, the main story would have been the Tar Heels gave up this soul-crushing touchdown with 16 seconds left, just a play you can't allow to happen. And it was particularly disappointing because the Tar Heels had made such a nice effort, an impressive effort, to get the game back within reach after trailing by 2 scores for a majority of the game. They did a lot impressively to get this game tied, and we'll talk about all that in a second. But, of course, the game changed, or the storyline changed dramatically a couple minutes after the game when Mac Brown announced first with us on the Tar Heel Sports Network in the Continental Tire Coach's Corner, and then with the full media afterwards that he had been informed that Tylee Kraft had passed away earlier in the day, and my impression of it was before the game on Saturday. If I understand the timeline correctly, Coach Brown, the players, nobody knew until after the game. Tylee's family obviously would know. They elected to continue with the honoring of him and his family between the first and second quarter. You had this very emotional scene, both in the stadium at large and then with Coach Brown and Tylee Kraft's mom, September is her name, as they embraced for a large portion of the entire ceremony, really. And we're very emotional, and Coach Brown said afterwards that even though he didn't know, obviously he felt like the news probably wasn't good after he had this emotional moment with Tylee's mom. So, Adam, clearly that took the center stage as far as the story coming out of this game, the difficulty first and foremost for Tylee's family at the end of this incredibly challenging journey, the Tar Heel football side of it, of how you try and manage this locker room of guys, some of which knew Tylee better than others, of course, just depending on kind of their experience with Carolina, particularly guys like J.J. Jones and Kobe Paysour and Gavin Blackwell. I think, those are just a handful of the guys who knew him really well. How Mac Brown and the coaches manage and handle all of this. And so it was a very real-world reminder that, yes, the thing that happened on the field was really disappointing, and this season has gone in a very poor direction here over the last month, and the Tar Heels got to try and figure that out. But there were things just much bigger than that were pushed to the forefront when it was all said and done.
Yeah, I mean, that scene in between the first and the second quarter, that's probably the most emotional thing I've ever seen at Kenan Stadium. Like,
really?
It was on the, like, in my Kenan Stadium life, on the one pole would be Gio running the punt back, and the polar opposite would be that. Just the video, the way that everything Carolina football paused, like normally between the first and second quarter, I'm meeting with your position coach and getting on the grease board. No one did that on the Carolina side. And it was jarring because on the Georgia Tech side, they were carrying on with their football things. But every single player and coach stopped on the Carolina sideline to watch the video. Mac Brown walks down to visit with the Kraft family, and then he and September Kraft share that long hug that you talked about. And I mean, it really makes you wonder, and anybody who's been through this knows, like when your loved one is very sick like this, which I think it's fair to say Tylee Kraft was a loved one to many members of the football team and coaching staff. It is all consuming. Mm-hmm. And you're always surprised when you go out in the world and normal world things are happening. And then you remember, like, oh yeah, everyone else is carrying on with their life. How did you manage a football team even just this last week when some of them were feeling that all-consumed way? I mean, as Coach Brown has talked more about what's been going on, and Mitch Mason talked about it some, you got players making visits to the hospital. You've got players making visits to the family house. You've got players going to say goodbye to their teammate on Thursday and Friday to then play a game on Saturday at noon. How would you ever even consider doing that? And so, I mean, that's almost more to the second half of this discussion about the game. But I do think, obviously, there have been a lot of stories this year coaching-wise. But in terms of someone at the head of that group of humans,
yeah,
I really think Mack Brown is the one you want. Just to help 18 to 22-year-olds figure out what is happening in the world, that one of their peers can go through this terrible disease for 2 years. Tylee was on the pod October 11th of 2022. So two years to the day before we had Mitch Mason on Friday. How can that possibly happen? If I don't understand it, I feel pretty sure that the J.J. Joneses and Javari Ritzies and every other player on the roster, they don't understand it either. So I do think, for whatever else has happened this year, having Mack Brown oversee all of that is where you want him to be.
Yeah, a couple of things. Not that it needed to be said in the moment, but pretty clearly, Carolina football and Mack Brown, I mean, people knew that we were closing in on this moment. Didn't know when it would be, but knew, unfortunately, that it was going to be soon. And, right on down to us having Mitch come on Friday to, changing what our plan was just because it was the right thing to do. So clearly they knew that this moment was imminent. And to your point, there were some very difficult and emotional things that happened last week with Carolina football away, having nothing to do with the game, as they tried to navigate this very difficult situation. Something I had not really considered that Mack Brown said, and I have heard more about, and I think you've probably heard more about too here recently, is even some people who have had to deal with this from other aspects of their life. If they had a loved one who was sick or a friend who may have passed away from cancer, and just kind of all of this bringing those feelings back to the forefront for them. Of course, sad for Tylee and his family, but also having these other things kind of brought back to the top of their mind and feel those feelings more rawly again. And that has been very difficult. And, of course, when you're dealing with a football program, we're talking hundreds of people involved between the players and the coaches and the support staff. So just the stats tell you that there's going to be several folks within those hundreds of people that have had to deal with something like this on a firsthand basis. So I think you have that layer to it as well. I will say I don't know whose decision it was to have that 13 seconds of positivity. I thought that was really cool. I mean, in a difficult situation, and, the Georgia Tech, at that point, the Georgia Tech sideline stopped and clapped, and all the Georgia Tech fans did as well. And so I thought that was I was not on the field with the Kraft family. I think if I had been in that situation as a member of a family dealing with that would have been impactful for me, I think. So I hope it was for them. I thought that was a neat moment in the stadium.
Yeah, I did too. I mean, that whole thing just seemed right. Like, I think it let you know a little bit about Tylee Kraft as a person from the video standpoint. It also reminded you that, I mean, he's been on the sideline as recently as this season. It's not like we're talking about
the Duke game,
a 60-year-old.
Yeah.
Like, we're talking about very recent past time that these players and coaches saw him there with them. And to be able to have his family there so that I mean, like you said, there's no way to have any idea how they individually were dealing with it. But I would think just having that large amount of people supporting you would make you feel somewhat better in the absolute worst day of your life.
So as Adam and I are speaking, and you may know something that I don't, I have not heard of any kind of celebration, or I don't know what the next steps are as Adam and I are talking right now. Clearly, there's going to be a more private situation that evolves, and then I would assume there would be some kind of a public thing. And I'm not saying like everybody comes to Keene Stadium and is sad. I'm saying that there will be some kind of opportunity to reach out or do something. And, of course, the GoFundMe for Tylee's family is still very much active and appreciated if that is an area that you feel comfortable helping with, can help with, and if it's something that is important to you. So what the next steps are, I don't know. But, Adam, I can say the open date comes at a wonderful time from this regard. Carolina, from the football perspective, I felt like they were going to need it anyway, and they do. But I would think it would be very challenging to try and play a game this weekend for Carolina had one been scheduled. So to have that opportunity to have a little extra time feels like it was needed.
Well, remember, the normal game week schedule is you'd come back in there Sunday and have meetings and start getting ready for whoever the next opponent is. I mean, imagine if the Tar Heels had to come in there and get ready for opponent X. Yeah. That's just not feasible. I still go back to, I'm not quite sure how it was feasible to get ready for Georgia Tech. But I mean, obviously the Tar Heels did. They played the game. That's a completely separate discussion. But I just can't imagine not having a bye week this week with all that went into Saturday in every way.